welcome to my presentation. This is going to be a full coverage of what my trip in Europe looked like. So over the course of a month, we studied in Spain, we also studied in Holland, in Amsterdam over there, and then Berlin, Germany. So I'm going to be talking about each one of those today and how I found some cool creative things along the way. So first in Madrid, this served as our home base for being the city that our cohort would travel out from and throughout the trip. So when it came to creativity, Madrid had absolutely no lack of it. It was filled with so much energy and so much passion, just integrated into like the food and the culture, the fashion. There was a lot of art that we saw. First, let's talk about the food. So Spain really stood out to me when it came to food, just because they stuck so well to tradition, but also incorporated that into new different ways as well. So firstly, with the food culture over there, it's so different from America. They eat much later in the night and also have this thing called tapas, which is small plates, and the purpose for food over there is more for socializing rather than the way Americans treat food, which is like fuel. But over there, food is meant to be something where you take your time and where you be with one another, have a conversation. So things were much slower paced, when it came to food over there. Whereas in America, we usually just eat and be on our way. The following staples of the Spanish food brand are seafood, fine cheeses, artisanal bread, potatoes, and of course the Iberico ham. So next is creativity and fashion. This is something I noticed a lot throughout the women and men too, living in Spain. They like to use a lot of bold pieces, a lot of color, and that color kind of just reflects the culture of the city and how colorful and friendly the city is. They're not afraid to stand out. In America, I noticed that fashion here is very comfort-based, but over there it's very more artistic based. So in Madrid, we visited the agency called Good Rebels, and this agency really talked a lot about their most proud client, IKEA. They're the reason that IKEA is big today, and they mentioned how IKEA stands out in the way that it's a furniture store that you browse through, and by the end of your trip, it's very unique on its own, and Good Rebels really made IKEA its own brand. There's no furniture store like it, and so Good Rebels really captures that and makes them stand out in that way. The next agency we visited was The Cocktail, and this was headed by Keiko, who was one of Ishmael's previous students. Something that really stood out to me about this agency was Keiko's lecture on the creative process and how freedom was very important in the culture of their office, and how they didn't really have tight standards for how their employees should function in the work office, as long as the job gets done, but also done well. And that's where they found it was easy to be creative and come up with new ideas, because there was so much freedom in that. So in Sevilla, we took a flamenco class and also saw a flamenco show. The flamenco dance captures the passion that the country of Spain incorporates throughout their country. The moves are strong and fierce and capture emotion beautifully throughout the movement. So this is not a subtle dance at all. When we saw the show, the dancers were just so full of emotion, and every step was purposeful, intentional, and said something about what the dancer was portraying emotionally. It was cool also to take a lesson in Sevilla too and practice what that looks like. Obviously we're not as good as the performers, but yeah, that was a highlight of the trip. So in Segovia, we saw this awesome thing called the aqueduct. It was built in 300 BC, and what's awesome about this aqueduct is it was meant to transport water from one part of the city to the other part of the city. It's extremely large, and it blew my mind because I also heard that the only thing that keeps this aqueduct up is gravity. So there's no nails, there's no fancy glue or anything that keeps it together. It's all just rocks piled on each other, very carefully, very intentionally. The arches are beautiful, and it's still standing today, which is amazing. So in Sevilla, we also saw creativity in Picasso. What's awesome about Picasso was this is the first artist that made me look look at art and I actually cried and felt what the artist was feeling. I put this piece up on purpose. It's because this is the crying mother. I remember when I first saw this piece, I just instantly felt what the mother was feeling, and it was the first time it made me cry. I've never looked at art and really feel what the artist was trying to portray emotionally, so it was really cool that Picasso was able to do that. He does that in lines that aren't straight and faces and proportions that aren't quote-unquote normal, but he captures emotion beautifully in doing that. So what's cool about Sevilla is we got to talk about creativity in church structure and the idea of an organic church. Sylvia's husband was actually the one who gave us the lecture on this, and he talked about how usually for church building today we think of programs and we think of big structures, and that's really like the basis of what people think of when they're starting a church, but he brought it down simply and talked about the organic church and how it should be built on fellowship and gospel and discipling and working with one another. And he even talked about how he has a parkour ministry that doesn't meet in a church but meets at like a restaurant or something, and that's their church, is when they talk about God and they learn from another and teach one another and keep each other accountable. And that was really beautiful to talk about the importance of fellowship in people, and that's the church aside from large buildings and great programs and budgeting and big events. So next we're going to talk about Holland. So Amsterdam was very unique. I thought that I would go to Amsterdam and it would be like similar to other European countries or cities that I've traveled before, but it was so distinctly its own in the sense that I've never seen another city like it, down to the buildings, down to the people, and down to the structure of the city, the art and the history that we saw over there. So it's hard for me to think of a city that stands out as much as Amsterdam does. It was so uniquely its own and unlike any city I had ever seen before. The physical format of the city, progressive culture, and art history displayed plenty of creative aspects that are like anything else in this world. So, like I mentioned before, there's nothing else like it. In Spain, because Spain I saw similarities with Mexico down in like Southern America, and culture, there was culture similarities, and in Berlin, which I'll talk about later, I see similarities with my own home city, Los Angeles. But for Amsterdam, it was so uniquely its own. First of all, the structure of the city is really interesting. It is, Ishmael said, it's like an onion, so there's different layers that are within the city, and it's all pointed to one center. So Ashley and I got lost for about 2 hours because of the layers and how confusing it was for us to get used to at first. It's very onion inspired, if that makes sense, and what separates the layers are the canals. So what was cool about the canals was they went throughout the entire city, and although there was a lot of tourists that would go on the boats on the canals, there was also buildings that were built on the canals and houseboats that people would live in on the canals. So I thought that was really cool how they didn't limit themselves to buildings and structures just on land, but they utilized the canals as much as they possibly could, not just for transportation, but also for living and shopping and such. So I saw a lot of distinctiveness in Amsterdam's culture. First of all, it's a very progressive culture. I did not expect to see as many quote-unquote coffee shops over there. So there was a ton of marijuana everywhere. At one point, I remember it was easier to find a coffee shop than it was to find a place to sit down and have lunch in, just because it was everywhere there. Even with their graphics, they're not a conservative country at all, and everything is so in your face, and things that are in your face are things that would otherwise be censored in America. So I wasn't used to being so startled by all of the progressiveness in the culture over there. Not a conservative country at all. I'm going to talk about the buildings now. Other than the structure of the city, the buildings themselves were very interesting. What I noticed was that the buildings had a certain slant on them. They leaned forward a little bit, and I thought that I was crazy for imagining that, but I realized that someone told me that they were built forward for a reason, in the sense that there's a hook at the very top of these kinds of buildings that are meant to, because the buildings are so narrow going up, they're meant to carry furniture to the level rather than bringing the furniture in through the front doorway and up the stairs. So that's why they lean forward in order to pull furniture up. And so this style of buildings makes up the entire city, not just houses, but stores and such. And they kept to their style. So these buildings are part of the brand and staple of what Amsterdam is and what it looks like. So there was a lot of creativity in Amsterdam's transportation. So because the city was an onion shape, there's canals that go through it, buildings are so narrow, streets are narrow too. So I was thinking as I was walking through there, there's no way that there could be a high-speed chase here. So more than cars, there was bikes, hundreds, thousands of bikes that would go throughout the city. I remember having to dodge them every time I would walk anywhere. So transportation was not just by car. A lot of it was by foot, a lot of it was by canals, and most of it was by the bikes going through. So it would be common for people to take a bike ride from work to school to home to get lunch. One of the agencies we visited in Amsterdam was 180 Kingsday, and this is actually my favorite agency of the entire trip. I'm going to read the mission statement. It says 180 Kingsday is an award-winning international creative agency based on the beautiful canals of Amsterdam. 180 Kingsday sees the world not as it is, but as it could be. To accomplish the transformation of brands, the agency sets out to make brands more famous, more human, and a more seamless part of people's lives. 180 Kingsday is part of the 180 Global Micro Network with offices in Amsterdam, Los Angeles, and China. A part of Omnicom Group Inc., 180 employs 200 people from over 30 countries. So what was cool about this agency was, first of all, they were so laid back, and the culture of the office was so friendly, but also very international. They said that they make it a goal for them to incorporate as many different ethnicities into their offices as much as possible, just because they want to be able to not just be from one culture. They want to be worldwide, and that helps their business actually. So love that office. Might be contacting them soon for a possible internship in LA. The next agency we visited in Amsterdam was Ogilvy. This is their mission statement. In the beginning, there was one Ogilvy, the company founded by David Ogilvy in 1948. Today, there is again one Ogilvy in 83 countries and 132 offices. We are one doorway to a creative network. We founded to make brands matter in a complex, noisy, hyper-connected world. I was super impressed by this agency. We walked in and there was literally a shopping cart full of all their awards. So they're good and they know it too. They're very renowned worldwide. They're one of the more renowned PR agencies that we visited. And it's because they're good at what they do and they know it. They represent brands well and push the boundaries on how brands are represented. When we went over there, they talked about, for one brand, they implemented a video game on a Snapchat story, and that was something like I had never seen before. Similar to 180 Kingsday, they were very laid back. For me, a little bit too laid back, but just because I feel like there's a bit of a cockiness to them, but I think their confidence is part of what makes them good. So in Harlem, we visited a windmill factory, or a windmill museum, and got to listen to a lecture on how windmills were made. I didn't realize that I didn't know that a windmill was to mill things. I just never thought about windmills as much as I did when we went here. But it was cool to see how this structure here, first and foremost, functions without electricity and does so much just by the construction of what's going on inside. I couldn't really find a structure of what it looks like on the windmills for the inside to show on the slideshow, just because, first of all, they all have different structures on the inside but are all wind powered, and that's the goal for these things would be to mill grain or to do different sorts of things. So really cool thing that we saw in Harlem. In Amsterdam, I do want to talk about the YWAM ministry that we saw there. This is what the structure that we stayed at. What was cool about this was it was filled with so many different young Christians from all over the world who dedicated their lives to serving in Amsterdam. One of the guys that I met, his name was George. I asked him how long he's been at this YWAM, and he said he's going on 8 years now. He started when he was 18 or 17, I believe. Oh, there we go. And just hasn't left since, just because he feels such a calling towards serving in the Amsterdam area, specifically in the red light district area. What was cool about the structure was not only do they take in young missionaries, but also groups that would like to serve for a shorter period of time. There's housing for them there, and beyond that, I looked up on their website, they also offer workshops for people who want to grow in certain things such as worship and art and ministry. So yeah, super cool about Amsterdam YWAM. We were also able to sit in on one of their midweek services, and it was so nice to be able to worship with these other believers, especially in such a progressive progressive and honestly kind of dark city like Amsterdam, because I noticed that there was a lot of darkness in that city. So it was cool that there was this safe haven there, and you can tell that this place really stood out in Amsterdam, especially by the people. So next we're going to be talking about Germany, specifically Berlin. So I hesitated to put Germany in the big letters here, just because I know that Berlin is so its own, aside from the entire country of Germany. A little side note, I was able to meet with two of my good friends who are born and raised in Germany, not in Berlin, and they met up with me in Berlin, and they told me that this does not fully encapture all of Germany, because Berlin is so much its own entity, and that's partly due to the history of Berlin being separated from the entirety of the country for a lot of years, until the Berlin Wall went down, and we'll get on that right now. Berlin was electric. The energy of the city and its people reflected how far the city has come since its history of turmoil and separation. Because Berlin had experienced years of separation and bondage, the city erupted in creative outbursts as a means to cope and express feelings. So before we talk about the Berlin Wall, I think it's important to know the history of Germany in general, because that does play into a fact of why Berlin is the way it is. World War II is the largest key factor into the identity of who Germany is as a country today. Following a traumatic war, the country needed to make steps forward on how they were going to allow the war to change and shape them as a nation. And they do that very well. When I visited Berlin, and just talking to the locals, talking to my friends, and visiting different places, this is so ingrained still to this day into their steps forward as a country. In Berlin, there was the Holocaust Memorial. This is a picture of it. If you could imagine, these stones are at different shapes, and it goes for a good portion of land, and you can walk through them, and they're all varying in shapes or varying in sizes. And this is right by Brandenburger Tor, and also next to the location where Hitler killed himself. You go in there, and it's super symbolic of just kind of the darkness of everything that went on during the war. It's just a quiet area. You walk through, and you're supposed to be respectful for a good reason, just because this, like I mentioned, like this era and time is so crucial to who Germany is as a country, and they put this up there, and other memorials like this are ingrained in smaller portions throughout the city and throughout the country as well, but this is one of the bigger ones and most visited ones. Aside from that, there's also the Berlin Wall. Prior to being torn down, the Berlin Wall separated Berlin, and it was a very crucial time. I remember hearing the tour guide talk about how families were just separated. They didn't care who was on which side of the wall. They were putting the wall down, and as a means of reacting and coping, that wall had a lot of art on the west side of it, at least, where there was a little more freedom to do so. This is obviously not the exact art that was on there, because it has since been torn down, but the pieces that do remain up, there is colorful art like this that reflects that time. I even know that in the gift shops they were selling different pieces of the Berlin Wall. What was interesting about Berlin, and this is partly why it reminds me of Los Angeles a little bit, was the mix of cultures there. I saw a lot of Middle Eastern people who were there, or in other ethnicities that you wouldn't necessarily associate with the word German. Also, we visited, we had a lecture on the difference between an immigrant and a refugee, and it really opened my eyes to the need. Firstly, an immigrant is someone who is escaping for a better, leaving their country for better opportunity, work opportunity, climate opportunity, just because it's better for their quality, or better for opportunity in general. But a refugee leaves their country because it is a life or death situation, because they have no choice, because if they were to stay in their home country, life would not be better, but also there might not be a life for them there at all. Their safety is at risk. And knowing the difference between the two of those really opened my eyes to the need for refugees to find a safe haven, because for a lot of them they don't really have a choice and do seek to go home, whereas immigrants tend to not want to go home as much as refugees long to. Something that we saw in Berlin was the Van Gogh Museum. Sorry. On the left side is Vincent van Gogh's personal self-portrait that he made of himself. His left ear is shown because his right ear was apparently cut off by him. So yes, he was a crazy madman, but he was also an artistic genius. On one of the pieces that I really loved about his is you'll see it on the bottom right, is the blossom piece that he made there. So Vincent van Gogh is known for being reckless, a little crazy, not right in the mind, not really having the best time, always in turmoil, it seemed like. But the blossom piece on the bottom right was one of his only pieces that reflect a happy time. This is when his brother not his brother gave birth to a son, obviously, because he can't give birth to a son, but his brother's wife, or I don't even know if they were married. His brother had a son, and I remember, and the tour guide was talking about how Vincent was so excited for him. Him and his brother had a very close relationship. And so this was one of those few times in his life that he was actually happy and excited about something, and he put it into this painting of the cherry blossoms to represent new life, and the light colors reflect the joy and excitement he has for his brother's son. So in Berlin, I went and visited the Mall of Berlin, and you would think, oh, maybe there's no creativity in malls, but actually I went to this mall and not thinking of much. I just thought I was gonna buy like a top or something, but I was blown away at how intercultural this mall was. First and foremost, the food court had like every single country represented in their food court. And what was also interesting about the Mall of Berlin was they had a fashion show going on, which you can kind of see. There's a runway at the bottom there, and apparently they do this ever so often, where they have all of the brands and all of the shops in the mall participate in this fashion show, and models model and walk down the runway in clothes that are in sale in the stores. So I thought that was really cool. Me and Sandy and Lindsay and Monica and Ashley sat down on one of these fashion shows, and it was like a high-class fashion show, but it was a fashion show that was for the people, whereas usually fashion shows you would think are for upper class and for brands that you can't really afford. But I thought it was really cool that they incorporated that. So the Mall of Berlin is awesome. So that concludes my coverage of this trip and what stood out to me and all the creative aspects of it. Thank you so much for listening.